For 23 years, the most successful Japanese car company in America refused to put its own name on its cars. Not because it didn't have one, because that name had spent the 1930s and 40s building trucks and engines for Japan's military build-up, and by the time the fighting stopped, saying it out loud in an American showroom was close to a business death sentence. So the company did something almost nobody talks about today. It sold millions of cars in the United States under a name it invented, wore that name like a mask for over 2 decades, and built one of the great American success stories on the back of it. Then it spent close to $500 million tearing that mask off and very nearly destroyed everything it had built in the process. This is the story of Datsun, the fake American identity Nissan used to conquer the United States, and the decision to kill it that the company is arguably still paying for more than 40 years later. The company's real name is Nissan, and in the early 1930s it didn't even exist yet in the form Americans would eventually come to know. What existed was Dat Motor Car Company, a small Tokyo firm built in 1914 around the initials of 3 investors, Den, Ayama and Takeuchi. In 1931, DAT built a smaller car and called it the Datsun, son of DAT. There was just one problem. In Japanese, son sounds like the word for loss. Nobody wants their car named Loss. So in 1933, the company swapped one letter, landing on Datsun, a nod to the rising sun on Japan's own flag. In 1934, a new company called Nissan Motor Company, formed out of a merger involving the industrial conglomerate Nihon Sangyo, took control of DAT and inherited the Datsun name along with it. Through the rest of the 1930s and into the war, Nissan wasn't really a car brand. It was an arm of Japan's military build-up, manufacturing trucks, engines and equipment for the imperial war effort. Keep that fact in mind because it explains almost everything that happens next. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Nissan name carried the weight of everything that had just happened in the Pacific. American popular culture in the years afterwards wasn't exactly subtle about it either. Anything associated with Japan carried a stigma that had nothing to do with build quality and everything to do with memory. So in 1958, when the company finally shipped its first cars to the United States for the LA Auto Show, it did not send them wearing the name Nissan. It sent them as Datsuns, a word vague enough that most Americans had no idea it belonged to a Japanese company at all. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of story we tell here, the ones the financial press moves past too quickly. Stick around and hit subscribe, because there's a lot more where this came from. Datsun's American debut was not exactly a conquest. In 1958, the company sold 83 units of the Datsun 1000 sedan in the entire country. For comparison, Volkswagen had sold just 2 Beetles when it first tried the US market a decade earlier, so a slow start wasn't unusual for an unfamiliar import. What Datsun needed wasn't more inventory. It needed somebody who actually understood America, not somebody who understood Tokyo. Before any of that, though, Nissan needed the wider world to believe a Japanese car could actually compete at all. In 1958, a pair of Datsun 210s entered the grueling Mobilgus Rally, over 10,000 miles across the Australian outback. They won their class outright. It wasn't a huge headline in America, but inside Nissan it proved something the company badly needed proof of, that a Datsun could hold its own against cars from countries nobody questioned. That person, the one who'd actually turned that credibility into American sales, arrived in 1960, when Nissan sent an executive named Yutaka Katayama to the US to study the market. Katayama had his own complicated history with Nissan's military years. During the war, he'd been ordered to a Nissan plant in occupied Manchuria, and he later credited a last-minute transfer back to Japan with saving his life. He knew exactly what that old name carried, so when Nissan sent him to America, he didn't fight to sell it under the real name. He built the mask instead, and he built it better than anyone in Tokyo thought possible. Katayama, who Americans would come to call Mr. K, convinced Nissan to open a dedicated US sales company and became its first president. He had one strange idea for a Japanese auto executive in 1960, listen to the customer. A car sale doesn't stop at payment or delivery, that's simply the beginning, he liked to say, and he built an entire dealer network around that idea, training mechanics, funding service schools, treating every complaint as market research instead of an inconvenience. In 1968, he pushed through the Datsun 510, a $2,000 sedan with independent rear suspension that outclassed cars twice its price. In 1969, he championed a sports car almost nobody in Tokyo believed America wanted, the 240Z. It sold 45,000 units in 1971 alone, and more than 50,000 the year after that. Within a decade, roughly 1 million Z cars had found American driveways, a pace it took Chevrolet's Corvette 25 years to match. The 1973 oil crisis turned a nice little success story into a full-blown phenomenon. Suddenly, fuel-sipping Japanese cars weren't a curiosity, they were the answer. Nissan even ran a splashy ad campaign built around pop artists like Peter Max, urging Americans to own a Datsun original, and by 1975 Datsun had climbed to third place among all imports sold in America, just behind Toyota and Volkswagen. Volkswagen, meanwhile, had just lost the #1 import spot for the first time in over 15 years. Datsun, a name invented specifically so nobody would have to say Nissan out loud, was quietly becoming one of the most trusted brands in America. In 1977, its final full year under Katayama, the Datsun 210 alone sold 173,281 units, and Mr. K retired having built, from almost nothing, one of the great immigrant success stories in American retail, except the company behind it had never actually told anyone its real name. Back in Tokyo, the people who ran Nissan globally were starting to see all of that success as a problem. Here's the problem, in plain terms. By the late 1970s, Nissan was operating as two different companies, wearing two different faces. In Japan, at home, it was Nissan. In the US, Britain and dozens of other export markets, the same cars wore Datsun badges. Two names meant two ad campaigns, two brand identities, two entire sets of promotional material for every single car the company built anywhere on Earth. Meanwhile, Toyota and Honda were expanding globally under one consistent name everywhere they sold a car. Nissan's own executives increasingly believed the split identity was bleeding money and diluting the brand's global weight. A single worldwide name promised cleaner manufacturing, simpler design decisions, and a marketing budget that didn't have to be duplicated market by market. On a spreadsheet in Tokyo, it looked like an easy call. In the fall of 1981, Nissan's headquarters made that call. The Datsun name, the one that had built Nissan's entire American success story, the one Yutaka Katayama had spent 2 decades turning into a promise of value and reliability, would be phased out. Everywhere. Replaced by Nissan. The rollout began in 1982 with awkward co-branding, cars badged Datsun by Nissan, under a slogan that tried to have it both ways, Datsun, we are driven. By late 1983, Nissan dropped the pretense entirely with a new slogan that left no room for confusion. The name is Nissan. By the 1984 model year, new cars like the 300ZX rolled into US showrooms carrying zero Datsun badging anywhere on them. Britain finished its own version of the switch by the end of 1984. The rest of the world followed by 1986. The price tag for all of this ran close to $500 million. $30 million just to replace signage at 1,100 Datsun dealerships across the country. $200 million on the advertising blitz explaining the switch. Another $50 million on Datsun-branded materials that had already been printed, then scrapped mid-campaign. And according to reporting from the time, this entire decision came down from Tokyo over the objections of many of the American dealers who had spent 20 years building that name's reputation, one customer at a time. Put yourself in a Datsun dealer's shoes in 1982. You've spent 2 decades building a local reputation on a name your customers trust completely. Now, corporate headquarters, 7,000 miles away, is telling you to tear your own signage off the building, often at your own expense, and start explaining to loyal buyers that the car they've always known as a Datsun is now, somehow, something called a Nissan instead. Plenty of ordinary shoppers never got that memo either. Dealer accounts from the period describe a wave of consumer confusion, with some buyers assuming Nissan was a brand new, unproven company, rather than the same reliable cars they'd already trusted for years. That kind of confusion is corrosive in a business built almost entirely on word of mouth and repeat customers. But something doesn't quite add up here. In 1985, right in the thick of the rebrand, Nissan actually posted its best ever year in the US, moving 830,000 vehicles, more than Toyota or Honda sold that same year. On paper, this looked like a win. It wasn't. The real cost of a rebrand this clumsy doesn't show up in year one. It shows up years later, once the marketing spend stops propping up the confusion and the brand has to stand on its own, on a name Americans never actually chose to trust. That's exactly what happened next. By the back half of the 1980s, the cracks were spreading fast. Nissan's own US market share slid from 5.4% in 1981 down to roughly 4.7% by the early 1990s. That doesn't sound like much until you look at who picked up the difference. Between 1986 and the early 1990s, Honda's US market share surged from 6.1% to 8.9%. Toyota's climbed from 5.6% all the way to 9.4%. While Nissan was busy explaining to America what its own new name meant, its two closest Japanese rivals were quietly eating its lunch, model by model, dealership by dealership. The bigger problem wasn't the confusion itself, it was the loyalty that confusion cost. Datsun buyers weren't just purchasing a car. Many were repeat customers who'd bought their second, third or fourth Datsun specifically because of the relationship Katayama's dealer network had spent 20 years building with them. That relationship didn't automatically transfer to a name those customers had never actually bought before in their lives. Not only did Nissan lose new buyers to Honda and Toyota, but its own most loyal Datsun owners also had less reason to come back at all. Between 1985, that peak sales year, and 1999, Nissan's total US sales shrank by a full 25%. This wasn't a one-time hit the company absorbed and moved past. It was the start of a slow bleed that would define the rest of Nissan's decade, and it was compounding the entire time quietly. Think about what the mask had actually been doing for 20 years. It let a company with a genuinely toxic wartime name walk into American living rooms and earn trust on its own merits, one honest transaction at a time. Take the mask off overnight, and all that trust doesn't automatically transfer to the face underneath. Some of it just evaporates. Nissan spent the back half of the 1980s discovering exactly how much. That's where things get worse. In 1993, Nissan posted its first pre-tax loss ever as a publicly traded company. It wouldn't be the last. The company went on to post losses in 7 consecutive years through the 1990s, at one point a loss approaching $2 billion in a single year. Inside the company, the culture that had once revolved around Katayama's obsession with the American customer curdled into something closer to bureaucratic drift. Nissan built too many factories, greenlit too many overlapping models, and struggled to make decisions fast enough to matter in a market that had already moved on without it. Analysts covering the company at the time pointed directly at the botched Datsun to Nissan transition as one of the costliest strategic mistakes in the company's history, a self-inflicted wound that widened every single year it went unaddressed. By 1999, Nissan was on the edge of outright collapse, carrying debt it couldn't service, and a brand identity it had spent 2 decades and $500 million trying to fix. The company that had once conquered America under a name it made up now needed a lifeline from someone else entirely. It found one in a global alliance with the French carmaker Renault, which took a 37% stake in exchange for a rescue package, and a new chief operating officer nobody in Japan had heard of yet, a Brazilian-Lebanese executive named Carlos Ghosn. The empire Katayama built by listening to American customers had been dismantled by a decision made without asking them anything at all, and it would take an outsider to try putting the pieces back together. Fast forward to today, and Nissan is in trouble again, and the numbers are brutal. For the fiscal year ending March 2025, Nissan posted a loss of $4.5 billion, the worst in its history. The company has cut close to 20,000 jobs. It's closing 7 of its 17 factories worldwide. It's slashing its vehicle platforms from 13 down to just 7, and it's paused nearly every new model planned for launch after 2026. In December 2024, Nissan and Honda announced talks to merge into a combined company that would have created the world's 3rd largest automaker. By February 2025, those talks were dead. Honda wanted Nissan in as a subsidiary, not an equal partner. Nissan said no. New CEO Ivan Espinosa, who took over the following spring in the middle of the crisis, put it bluntly. "This is not something that happened in the last couple of years," he told reporters, describing years of decisions finally catching up with the company all at once. Analysts see Nissan as the Japanese automaker most exposed to US tariffs on imported vehicles, a threat estimated at more than $3 billion a year in added costs alone. Layer that on top of an EV strategy that never found its footing and a wave of cheaper Chinese competitors flooding the same markets Nissan built its name in, and the picture gets grim fast. Toyota has reportedly opened informal talks about stepping in to help. Nothing is confirmed. What is confirmed is that Nissan, the company that once hid behind a made-up American name just to survive its own reputation, is now fighting for its life under the real one, with tariffs, Chinese competition, and its own history all working against it at the same time. Strip away the tariffs and the EV missteps and the failed merger, and there's an older story underneath all of it, one that started the day Nissan decided its own name was the problem. So what actually went wrong 40 years ago and again right now? It comes down to 3 mistakes. First, Nissan treated brand equity like something it owned outright, when it had actually been built, dollar by dollar and customer by customer, by Katayama's dealer network over 2 full decades. You cannot reclaim by memo what took 20 years of trust to earn. Second, the company executed a total identity change with almost no regard for the people who'd actually have to explain it face to face, its own dealers. A decision made in a Tokyo boardroom landed, on the ground in America, as a betrayal, and the customers who felt betrayed didn't stick around to hear the corporate logic behind it. Third, and this is the part that still applies today, Nissan mistook consistency for strategy. A single global name is not by itself a plan. It's a coat of paint. And a coat of paint cannot fix what's actually broken underneath, whether that's 1980s bureaucratic drift or a 2025 lineup that failed to keep pace with its competitors. Datsun, the fake name that conquered America, is long gone now, resurrected briefly as a budget brand for emerging markets in 2013, before being shelved for good in 2022. But the pattern it left behind, a company making decisions about its own identity without asking the people who actually built that identity, is still playing out in Yokohama boardrooms right now.